They say grief fades with time, but nobody tells you what happens when it doesn't. Every Sunday at exactly 6 in the morning, I drove to Rosewood Memorial Cemetery with a single white rose resting on the passenger seat beside me. Rain, snow, summer heat, it never mattered. For 3 years, I followed the same route through the quiet streets of Brooklyn while the city was still asleep. No security detail, no driver, no men in dark suits waiting nearby. Just me and the silence I carried everywhere. The cemetery gates were always open by the time I arrived. The groundskeeper knew better than to ask questions. Most people did. Adrian Blackwell was a name that made people lower their voices. Some spoke it with respect, others with fear. But none of that mattered here. None of it crossed those iron gates. Here, I was just a husband who had run out of second chances. The grass was still wet with morning dew as I walked towards Section C, row 12. My shoes sank slightly into the earth. The white marble headstone appeared between two old oak trees, exactly where it always was. Evelyn Blackwell, beloved wife, beloved friend, beloved everything. I knelt beside the grave and placed the rose against the stone. The petals trembled in the cold breeze. For a long moment, I simply stared at her name. 3 years. 3 years since the funeral. 3 years since the endless line of black cars. 3 years since I had stood beside a polished casket and listened to people tell me life would go on. They were wrong. Life had continued. That wasn't the same thing. My watch ticked softly in the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, birds greeted the sunrise. I remembered how Evelyn used to laugh at me for working too much. She would steal my phone during dinner and hide it in ridiculous places around the house. Once, I found it in the freezer between 2 cartons of ice cream. She claimed it was an intervention. The memory almost made me smile. Almost. A small voice broke through the silence. "Mommy, why is that man all alone?" I froze. The voice belonged to a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. I turned slightly and saw her standing a few yards away holding her mother's hand. Blonde curls, pink rain boots, curious blue eyes. The woman beside her looked embarrassed. She offered an apologetic smile. "Lily," she whispered gently. "That's not polite." But the little girl kept looking at me. Children had a way of seeing things adults ignored. She tilted her head and studied me for another second. "He looks sad." The words landed harder than any accusation ever could. I looked away first. The woman squeezed her daughter's hand and started guiding her toward another section of the cemetery. Yet before they left, the little girl glanced back one more time. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that single look stayed with me long after they disappeared between the rows of white stone. Some people enter your life like a storm. Others arrive so quietly that you do not notice they have changed something until long after they are gone. I remained beside Evelyn's grave for another 20 minutes after the woman and her daughter disappeared. The cemetery was beginning to wake up around me. A groundskeeper pushed a maintenance cart down a distant path. A pair of elderly visitors carried fresh flowers toward a neighboring section. Life continued moving forward. It always did. I was the only one standing still. Eventually, I rose to my feet and adjusted the collar of my dark coat. The rose remained against the marble stone, bright against the gray morning. I touched the edge of the headstone one last time before turning away. My car waited near the entrance. The engine started with a low hum. Normally, I would have driven straight back to the city, straight back to meetings, responsibilities, and a world built on schedules and expectations. Instead, I found myself taking a different road. 10 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop near the cemetery. It was the kind of place Evelyn would have loved. Warm yellow lights, handwritten menu boards, fresh pastries displayed behind glass. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive, just honest. I stepped inside and immediately regretted it. Not because of the coffee, because I recognized a familiar laugh. The little girl sat near the window, swinging her legs beneath a wooden chair. A half-finished hot chocolate rested in front of her. Across from her sat the woman from the cemetery, Grace. I did not know her name yet, but somehow it fit her before I ever heard it. She looked different without the morning mist surrounding her. Mid-30s, tired eyes, kind face. The kind of woman most people would overlook because she was too busy taking care of everyone else to draw attention to herself. Lily spotted me first. Her eyes widened. Then she waved enthusiastically across the room. The gesture was so unexpected that I actually stopped walking. Grace turned around. Embarrassment immediately crossed her face. "Lily," she whispered, "do not point. That is the sad man." Every conversation in the shop seemed to disappear for a second. Grace looked as though she wanted the floor to open beneath her feet. I should have left. Instead, I heard myself laugh softly. It surprised both of us. "It is okay," I said. Lily grinned. "I told Mom you looked lonely." Grace covered her eyes for a moment. "I am so sorry. Do not be." The words came out before I could stop them. She studied me carefully then. Not my clothes. Not the expensive watch on my wrist. Not the reputation that usually arrived before I did. Just me. For the first time in years, someone looked at me without wanting something, without fearing something, without expecting something. Lily held up a chocolate chip cookie. "Do you want half?" I stared at the broken cookie in her small hand. Such a simple offer. Such a ridiculous thing to feel emotional about. Yet something tightened unexpectedly in my chest. I had spent years surrounded by powerful people. None of them had ever offered me half a cookie. The cookie was slightly broken down the middle, one half larger than the other. Lily offered me the bigger piece without hesitation, as though generosity was the most natural thing in the world. I accepted it before my common sense could intervene. "Thank you," I said. Her smile widened immediately. Grace looked relieved that I was not offended. "You really do not have to encourage her," she said softly. "She talks to everyone. That is not the worst quality to have." Lily nodded as if I had confirmed something important. Then she returned to her hot chocolate while Grace studied me over the rim of her coffee cup. Outside, sunlight filtered through low gray clouds. The street beyond the window was beginning to fill with weekend traffic. Inside, the shop smelled like fresh cinnamon and roasted coffee beans. It felt strangely peaceful. Too peaceful. "You come to the cemetery every Sunday?" Grace finally asked. The question should have annoyed me. Most people avoided personal subjects around me. Yet something in her voice made it feel less like curiosity and more like concern. I looked down at the untouched coffee sitting in front of me. "Every Sunday." She nodded slowly. "Someone important." I almost laughed at the understatement. "My wife." For a second, silence settled between us. Grace's expression softened immediately. Not pity. Something gentler. Understanding. "I'm sorry." I stared out the window. Those two words usually irritated me. People said them because they felt obligated. Grace sounded like she meant them. 3 years, I said quietly. Some days it feels longer. Other days it feels like yesterday. Lily looked up from her drink. "My dad is gone too." Grace's eyes widened. "Lily, But the little girl simply shrugged. "It is okay, Mom. We talk about him." Her honesty caught me off guard. Children always seem to find the shortest path to the truth. I glanced toward Grace. She lowered her eyes briefly. "It has been 5 years," she said. "Lily was very young." I nodded. Neither of us elaborated. We did not need to. Loss recognized loss. The conversation drifted to safer subjects after that. Lily told me about school, about her science project involving butterflies, about a goldfish that had survived far longer than anyone expected. Grace occasionally corrected details while trying unsuccessfully to hide her amusement. For the first time in years, I found myself listening without checking the time, without thinking about work, without hearing the constant noise that usually filled my head. Then Grace's phone vibrated on the table. The moment she looked at the screen, something changed. Not fear, not exactly. Tension. She silenced the call immediately. A minute later it rang again, and then again. Lily noticed it too. "Mom, it is nothing, sweetheart." But it was not nothing. I could see that much. Grace slipped the phone into her purse and forced a smile. Yet the smile never quite reached her eyes. When she looked away, I caught a glimpse of exhaustion there. The kind that came from carrying too much for too long, and for reasons I could not explain. I found myself wondering who kept calling her and why the sound of that phone suddenly bothered me more than it should have. After we left the coffee shop, I told myself I would forget about Grace Miller. That should have been easy. My life was built on distance. Distance kept people safe. Distance kept me functioning. Yet the image of her forcing a smile while silencing those calls followed me throughout the afternoon. By evening, Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of lights outside my office windows. The city stretched for miles below, restless and alive. I stood alone with a glass of sparkling water in my hand, staring at traffic crawling across the bridges like streams of red and white stars. 3 years ago, Evelyn would have dragged me away from work by now. She hated seeing me spend Sundays in the office. The memory lingered longer than usual. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. My assistant stepped inside carrying a folder. "You have a meeting tomorrow morning." I nodded without turning. Then something made me ask a question I had no business asking. "Find out something for me." He hesitated. "Something about whom?" I looked out at the city. "Grace Miller." The answer arrived the next morning. The report sat unopened on my desk for nearly an hour before curiosity won. Grace was 34 years old. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small construction company in Queens. She rented a modest apartment. No luxury vacations. No hidden assets. No dramatic history. Just years of hard work and responsibility. Lily attended a nearby elementary school and consistently appeared on the honor roll. Everything about their lives looked ordinary, except for one detail. The repeated calls. According to the report, the number belonged to a private financial collection agency. I frowned. Grace had never struck me as reckless. Yet the calls continued several times every day. I closed the folder. It should have ended there. Instead, the following Sunday arrived faster than expected. At 6 in the morning, I found myself walking through Rosewood Memorial Cemetery once again. The air smelled like fresh rain. Clouds drifted across a pale gray sky. I placed another white rose beside Evelyn's headstone and stood quietly. Minutes passed. Then I heard familiar laughter floating through the rows of marble markers. Lily. I turned and saw her running carefully along a nearby path, while Grace followed behind, carrying a small bouquet of yellow daisies. The moment Lily spotted me, she waved both arms dramatically. "Mom, it is him." Grace looked up and immediately laughed under her breath. Of course it is. She approached with Lily beside her. The daisies rested gently in her hands. Good morning, she said. Good morning. Lily studied me for a second before asking, Do you always come alone? Grace looked horrified. Lily? What? The little girl asked innocently. It is a fair question. Surprisingly, I smiled. Yes, I always come alone. Lily thought about that answer. Then she glanced at her mother. Then back at me. Her expression became unusually serious. Nobody should always be alone. The words settled into the quiet morning air. Grace looked away as though she felt them too. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering whether the little girl might be right. The following week should have returned everything to normal. It did not. Monday became Tuesday. Tuesday became Friday. Yet I kept thinking about a little girl who believed nobody should always be alone. I kept thinking about her mother pretending everything was fine whenever that phone rang. On Friday evening, rain tapped softly against the windows of my office while I reviewed contracts that should have held my attention. Instead, my eyes drifted toward the city below. The lights blurred together beneath the storm. My phone buzzed. It was one of my associates calling about a business matter. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, I found myself asking another question I had no logical reason to ask. The collection agency connected to Grace Miller. What exactly do they want? There was a brief pause. Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. An old debt connected to her late husband's failed business venture. The balance is not large by corporate standards, but significant for a single-income household. I stared out at the rain. Has she missed payments? No, she has made every payment on time. They simply keep increasing the pressure. After the call ended, I remained motionless for several minutes. Something about that answer bothered me. Grace was doing everything right and still being punished for circumstances she had not created. It reminded me of something Evelyn used to say. Life was rarely fair, but people could choose whether they added to the unfairness or reduced it. Sunday arrived again. The cemetery looked different beneath bright sunshine. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Birds moved between the oak trees overhead. I placed my usual white rose beside Evelyn's grave. For the first time in years, the silence felt less heavy. Not because the grief had disappeared, because something else had begun sharing space with it. Hope. The realization unsettled me. I heard familiar footsteps approaching. Grace carried yellow daisies again. Lily held a small paper bag covered in colorful drawings. Good morning, Grace said. Good morning. Lily hurried forward and held out the bag. I made something for you. I accepted it carefully. Inside was a drawing created with bright crayons. 3 stick figures stood beneath a large sun. One was clearly Lily, one was Grace. The third had dark hair and stood awkwardly beside them. Above the drawing, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "You look less sad now." I stared at the paper longer than I intended. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Thank you, I said quietly. Lily smiled proudly. Grace looked embarrassed. She spent all week working on that. I folded the drawing carefully, more carefully than documents worth millions of dollars. Then Grace's phone rang again. The smile faded from her face instantly. She silenced it. A second later, a message appeared. Then another. Lily noticed her mother's expression and looked down at her shoes. The change was subtle, but impossible to miss. I finally spoke. Grace. She looked up. Yes. You do not have to tell me what is wrong. The wind stirred gently through the cemetery. But you do not have to carry it alone either. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I saw something fragile appear behind her eyes. Not fear, not sadness. Relief. Grace did not answer immediately. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass through the cemetery, while Lily wandered a few steps away to inspect a row of colorful flowers planted near a neighboring headstone. For several seconds, Grace simply stared at the phone in her hand. Then she released a slow breath. "I am tired," she admitted quietly. "That is the truth." Her voice sounded smaller than usual, more vulnerable. "Every month I make the payment. Every month they tell me it is not enough. Every month they find a new fee or another reason why the balance somehow grows instead of shrinks." I listened without interrupting. "I keep telling myself it will end eventually." She laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "But lately I am not so sure." I glanced toward Lily. The little girl was kneeling beside the flowers, completely absorbed in her own world. "Does she know?" Grace followed my gaze. "Only that money has been tight." Her expression softened immediately. "I work very hard to make sure she still feels like a child." Something about that sentence stayed with me. Maybe because Evelyn would have understood it. Maybe because I could hear the exhaustion behind every word. "She is lucky," I said. Grace looked surprised. "Why?" "Because she has you." For a moment, her eyes shimmered with emotion she clearly did not expect. She looked away first. The conversation shifted after that. We walked slowly through the cemetery paths while Lily skipped ahead. She pointed out birds, unusual cloud shapes, and a squirrel she claimed was following us. The simple normalcy of it felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. My phone rang once. I silenced it. A few minutes later, it rang again. Then again. Grace noticed. "Important?" she asked. I looked at the screen before putting it away. "Not today." She smiled. "That must be nice." The words caught me off guard. Most people assumed power meant freedom. The truth was often the opposite. Before I could answer, Lily suddenly appeared beside us holding a small yellow flower. "This one is for Miss Evelyn." My chest tightened. "What?" She held out the flower proudly. "Everybody should get flowers." Grace immediately looked embarrassed. "Lily, sweetheart, you cannot pick flowers from the cemetery." "I found it on the ground." She paused. "Can we take it to her?" I stared at the tiny flower resting in her hand. It was imperfect. One petal bent slightly at the edge, yet somehow it felt more meaningful than the expensive roses I brought every week. Together, the three of us walked back toward Evelyn's grave. Lily carefully placed the flower beside the white rose. Then she stepped back and smiled at her work. The sunlight broke through the clouds overhead at that exact moment. Warm light touched the marble stone, touched the yellow flower, touched all of us. And for the first time in 3 years, standing beside Evelyn's grave did not feel like saying goodbye. It felt like being reminded that life still had a way of finding people who thought they were lost. 3 days later, I found myself doing something Evelyn would have laughed about. I was standing inside a small bookstore in Queens because Lily had mentioned during our walk that her favorite series was missing the newest volume. The realization struck me halfway through the store. I had negotiated deals worth millions of dollars without hesitation, yet somehow I felt ridiculous buying a children's book. The cashier smiled as she handed me the bag. "Gift?" she asked. I looked down at the colorful cover. "Something like that." The following Sunday arrived bright and cool. Autumn had begun painting the trees around Rosewood Memorial Cemetery with shades of gold and amber. I reached Evelyn's grave a few minutes early. For the first time in years, I was not alone. The thought settled strangely in my chest. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. I placed the white rose beside the headstone and stood quietly. My eyes drifted toward the path. A few minutes later, I saw them. Grace wore a light gray coat. Lily practically bounced beside her, carrying another bouquet of yellow daisies. The moment she spotted me, she sprinted forward. "You came." I could not stop the smile that appeared. "I usually do." She frowned dramatically. "No, I mean you came before us." Grace laughed softly. The sound carried through the crisp morning air. It was becoming one of my favorite sounds, a dangerous realization. We spent nearly an hour walking through the cemetery paths. Lily told endless stories about school. Grace occasionally corrected details while pretending not to enjoy them. I listened more than I spoke. For once, silence did not feel like protection. It felt like participation. Eventually, we sat on a wooden bench overlooking a small pond near the edge of the grounds. Ducks drifted lazily across the water. Fallen leaves floated near the shore. Lily chased them while Grace and I remained behind. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then she surprised me. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." She studied the pond instead of looking at me. "Why do you keep coming back?" The question was simple. The answer was not. I watched the ripples spreading across the water. "Because I thought leaving would mean forgetting." Grace turned toward me. I continued before I could change my mind. After Evelyn died, I convinced myself that grief was the last thing I had left of her. If I let it go, I would lose her completely. Grace listened quietly. No interruptions, no judgment. "And now?" she asked. The breeze moved through the trees overhead, somewhere nearby. Lily laughed at something only she understood. For the first time, I considered the question honestly. Now I am beginning to wonder if she would have wanted that. Grace's expression softened. She looked down at her hands. "The people we love do not disappear because we start living again." The words hit harder than she could have known. Something shifted inside me. Small, fragile, important. Then Lily came running back toward us, holding a bright red leaf above her head like a trophy. "Look what I found," she shouted. Grace smiled. I smiled too. And for the first time in 3 years, the future did not feel like a betrayal of the past. It felt like a door that had been quietly waiting for me to open it. The next Thursday evening, rain drifted softly across Queens like a gray curtain. I was leaving a meeting downtown when my phone buzzed with a message I did not expect. It was Grace. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. We had exchanged numbers weeks earlier after Lily insisted that friends should be able to call each other. The message was short. "Thank you." Attached was a photograph. Lily stood in their small apartment, holding the book I had secretly arranged to be delivered through a local bookstore. Her smile was so wide it nearly swallowed her face. I found myself smiling back at a photograph like a fool. Then another message arrived. "She has read 3 chapters already." I typed a response. "That is impressive." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then returned. Grace was clearly deciding whether to say something else. Finally, a new message appeared. The calls stopped. I knew immediately what she meant. Earlier that week, I had quietly instructed professionals to review the collection agency's practices. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just sunlight directed toward a situation that had survived for too long in the shadows. The result had been immediate. The constant pressure vanished. The endless messages stopped. The balance was corrected. The harassment ended. Grace still had responsibilities, but now she had fairness. I looked at her text for a long moment before replying. Good. That was all. No explanations, no credit. Some gifts were better left unnamed. Sunday arrived carrying clear blue skies and cool autumn air. The cemetery looked almost beautiful beneath the sunlight. Gold leaves covered parts of the pathways. The oak trees swayed gently overhead. When Grace and Lily arrived, something felt different, lighter. Grace's shoulders no longer carried the same invisible weight. Even Lily seemed to notice. She skipped ahead, singing a song she had learned at school while Grace walked beside me. "You did something," she said quietly. I kept my eyes forward. "What makes you think that—" She laughed softly. "Because problems do not disappear overnight." I did not answer. She studied me for a second before shaking her head. "You know, that is the frustrating thing about you." "Only one?" Her smile widened. The sound warmed something inside me. We reached Evelyn's grave together. The white rose rested against the marble stone. Beside it sat a small collection of yellow flowers Lily had brought over the past several weeks. The contrast made me pause. White and yellow. Grief and hope. Past and future. Grace stood quietly beside me. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course." She looked toward the headstone. "I think she would be happy." My chest tightened unexpectedly. "You did not know her?" "No." Grace's voice remained gentle. "But I know what love looks like when someone carries it for years." I could not speak for a moment. The wind moved softly through the cemetery. Somewhere nearby, church bells echoed faintly across the neighborhood. Then Lily ran back toward us, holding both of our hands without asking permission. One small hand wrapped around Grace's fingers, the other wrapped around mine, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. And standing there beneath the autumn sky, I realized something that would have terrified me only months earlier. I was no longer afraid of losing the people I loved. I was afraid of never letting myself love them at all. Winter arrived quietly that year. The trees around Rosewood Memorial Cemetery stood bare against pale skies, their branches tracing delicate patterns above the rows of marble stones. Snow covered the ground in a thin white blanket the Sunday everything finally changed. I carried 2 roses instead of 1. The realization struck me halfway through the cemetery gates. For 3 years, I had brought a single white rose every week. Now there were 2, 1 white, 1 yellow. My footsteps crunched softly across the snow as I approached Evelyn's grave. The air smelled clean, peaceful, different. I placed the white rose beside the headstone and stood quietly for a moment. The familiar ache was still there. I suspected it always would be. But grief no longer felt like a prison. It felt like love that had learned how to breathe. A few minutes later, I heard laughter behind me. The sound instantly brought a smile to my face. Grace and Lily were walking down the path together. Lily wore a bright red scarf wrapped 3 times around her neck. She looked like a walking snowman. The moment she saw me, she ran forward. "We made it before the snow started again," she announced proudly. Grace laughed. "Barely." They joined me beside the grave. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The silence felt natural, comfortable, like family dinners after everyone had finished talking and simply enjoyed being together. Lily carefully placed a small handmade ornament beside the flowers. It was shaped like a star. "For Miss Evelyn," she explained, "because stars help people find their way home." My throat tightened. Grace squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently. "That is beautiful, sweetheart." We stood there together while soft snowflakes drifted from the sky. Then Grace reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I found this last week," she said quietly, "at a used bookstore." I looked at the letter she handed me. The handwriting on the front stopped my breath. It was Evelyn's, years ago. She had donated several boxes of books and journals during a charity drive. Somehow one letter had ended up forgotten between the pages of a novel. My hands trembled as I opened it. The message inside was short. "If you are reading this someday, it means life kept moving. Promise me something. Do not build a home out of grief. Build one out of love." I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I looked up. Grace stood beside me. Lily held her mother's hand. Snow continued falling around us, and suddenly I understood. Evelyn had never been asking me to stay with her. She had been asking me to keep living. Slowly, I placed the letter beside the roses. Then I offered one hand to Lily and the other to Grace. They both took them without hesitation. Together, we stood before the grave while 3 shadows stretched across the snow. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a man visiting the past. I felt like a man finally walking toward the future. And somehow, I think Evelyn would have smiled.